Most people, when they imagine sleeping in a medieval royal castle, picture something like a fairy tale. A grand canopied bed draped in velvet, a crackling fire throwing golden light across stone walls, a king or queen sinking into soft pillows at the end of a long and ceremonial day, drifting peacefully into darkness, while the world outside held still. It is a picture that has been painted so many times, in so many films and novels and illuminated manuscripts, that it has come to feel almost true. But the truth, as it almost always is when you look closely enough, was something considerably stranger, considerably more interesting, and considerably less comfortable than the image suggests. Sleep in a medieval royal castle was not a private act. It was not quiet. It was not solitary. It was not even, in the way we understand the word today, particularly restful. It was a social event, a political performance, a hierarchical ritual, and a biological necessity, all tangled together into something that the people who lived it would not have recognized as strange, because it was simply the way things were. And yet, from the distance of several centuries, it is one of the most revealing windows we have into the texture of daily life inside those enormous stone structures that still rise above the landscapes of Europe. Mysterious and half understood, visited by tourists who walk their halls and wonder what it was really like to live within them. To understand sleep in a royal castle, you have to first understand something about the nature of the castle itself. A castle was not primarily a home. It was a statement. It was a fortress, a seat of power, an administrative centre, a military installation, and a residence all at once. The stone walls that made it defensible also made it cold in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate unless you have stood inside an unheated medieval building in the middle of winter, and felt the particular quality of that cold, a cold that does not simply surround you, but seems to emanate from the stone itself, as if the rock has been absorbing the chill of centuries and is now slowly releasing it into the air around you. Even in summer, the lower floors of a large stone castle could be startlingly cool. In winter, they could be brutal. The response to this cold shaped almost everything about how people slept. It shaped the architecture of sleeping rooms, the design of beds, the choice of textiles, the arrangement of bodies in space, and the social rules that governed who slept where and with whom. Cold was not merely an inconvenience. It was a constant presence, a force to be managed, a problem that required practical solutions and that left its mark on the material culture of the castle in ways that are still visible today if you know what you are looking for. The great hall of a medieval castle was the heart of the building. It was where meals were eaten, where business was conducted, where visitors were received, where the lord or king demonstrated his wealth and power through hospitality. And in many castles, particularly in the earlier medieval period, it was also where a great many people slept. This is perhaps the first and most fundamental way in which sleeping in a castle differed from our modern experience. The great hall was not empty at night. It was full of bodies, servants, retainers, household knights, lower-ranking officials, travelling guests. All of these people might spread their bedrolls or simple pallets on the rushes of the great hall floor, and sleep there in proximity to one another, in the residual warmth of the fire that had burned during the evening meal and was now fading into embers. The smell of the hall at night would have been considerable. Rushes on the floor were changed periodically, but not daily. Dogs wandered freely. People had not bathed recently. The smoke from the fire, which in many early hall designs had no chimney, but simply drifted up toward a hole in the roof, would have been present in the air even after the fire died down, clinging to clothing and hair and the rough weave of woolen blankets. This was not seen as degrading. It was simply the reality of communal life in a large household. The hierarchy was expressed not in who slept inside and who slept outside, but in where inside you slept and on what. The lord slept furthest from the door at the high end of the hall, often on a raised dais or in an adjacent private chamber if the castle was large enough to have one. The higher your rank, the better your bedding. The closer you were to the fire, the more protection you had from draughts. The lower your rank, the further you might find yourself from warmth. The thinner your blanket, the harder your sleeping surface. In the earlier centuries of the medieval period, even relatively high-ranking individuals often slept in the hall. The concept of a truly private bedroom, a room reserved for sleeping and for nothing else, accessible only to the person who slept there, was not yet fully developed. Privacy, as a value, existed, but it expressed itself differently. A great lord might have a chamber adjacent to the hall, but that chamber was itself not entirely private. It was where he conducted private business, received intimate visitors, and slept, all in the same space. And he did not necessarily sleep there alone. The bed of a medieval king or high lord was an object of extraordinary symbolic importance. It was, in many ways, one of the most significant pieces of furniture in the entire castle. The royal bed of England, for instance, was a massive, heavily carved wooden structure surrounded by textile hangings. The tester above, the cellure or canopy, suspended over it, the curtains on all four sides that could be drawn closed to create something approaching a room within a room. These hangings are not primarily decorative. They were functional. They trapped body heat inside the enclosed space, creating a warm microclimate that made the difference between a cold night and a tolerable one. They also provided a degree of visual and auditory privacy in a world where true solitude was rare. The materials used in a royal bed were markers of extraordinary wealth. The wooden frame might be carved from oak or walnut, or even more exotic imported woods, decorated with heraldic devices or religious imagery. The mattress, and a great lord might have several layered on top of one another, was filled with the finest available materials. Wool, horsehair, and feathers were all used, with down being the most desirable and most expensive. The sheets were linen, a fabric that required considerable labour to produce and was therefore a marker of wealth. The blankets and coverlets might be of wool, silk, or fur-trimmed fabrics that represented the accumulated wealth of trade networks stretching across Europe and beyond. But here is the thing that the picture of solitary royal sleep always leaves out. The king did not sleep alone in that magnificent bed. Not because he was always accompanied by a queen or a lover, though that was sometimes the case, but because the culture of the time did not conceive of sleeping alone as a normal or desirable state for most people. Sharing a bed was ordinary, it was warm, it was efficient, and for the highest-ranking individuals it was also a matter of security and ceremony. The royal bedchamber was staffed. This is perhaps the most alien aspect of royal sleep to a modern reader. The king's bedroom was not a private sanctuary, but a workplace for a specific group of household servants whose entire professional identity was organised around the care of the royal body during its most vulnerable hours. In England, the groom of the stool was one of the most coveted positions in the entire royal household, a position that involved attending the king during his most intimate bodily functions, including both elimination and sleep. The position was held by noblemen, not low servants. It was sought after, competed for inherited through political favour. The proximity it offered to the king, the trust it implied, made it one of the most powerful positions at court. At night, in many royal households, members of the bedchamber staff slept in the same room as the king or directly outside the door. This was partly security. A sleeping monarch was vulnerable, and having trusted attendants nearby reduced the risk of assassination or sudden illness going unnoticed. But it was also simply the normal structure of a world in which most people of any rank slept in proximity to others. Solitude at night was not the norm. It was not particularly sought after. The silence and darkness of a room in which one lay entirely alone would have felt strange, perhaps even frightening to many people of the medieval period. Yeah, the great lords and kings of medieval Europe were accompanied by their household even to sleep. When a king travelled, and medieval kings travelled constantly, moving between castles and manors as the administrative needs of their kingdoms required, the royal bed travelled with him. Not just the mattresses and linens, but in many cases the entire wooden bed frame, disassembled and loaded onto carts along with the hundreds of other objects that constituted a functioning royal household on the move. A royal progress was an extraordinary logistical undertaking, and the bed was central to it. Setting up the royal bed in a new location was one of the first tasks undertaken upon arrival at a new residence. The Queen had her own bedchamber, her own staff, her own elaborate rituals of sleeping and waking. The separation of royal couples into distinct chambers was not unusual, particularly in larger and more formal households. Queens were surrounded by ladies-in-waiting and female servants, who managed everything from the preparation of the bed to the maintenance of the fire to the handling of the Queen's clothing and personal hygiene. These women were not merely servants. Many of them were of noble birth themselves, daughters of important families who had been placed in the Queen's household as a form of education and social positioning. They slept in the Queen's chamber, on small beds or pallets arranged around the great bed, close enough to be called upon at any hour. The intimacy of this arrangement was genuine. Ladies-in-waiting knew things about the Queen's body that few others did. They knew the pattern of her menstrual cycle, the quality of her sleep, the state of her health, her nighttime fears and habits. This knowledge was a form of power, but also a form of service, and the relationships that developed within the close quarters of the royal bedchamber could be among the most durable and emotionally significant of a queen's life. When we read the letters and accounts left by medieval and early modern queens, we find evidence of genuine affection for the women who surrounded them in these intimate hours. The preparation of the royal bed for sleep was itself a ceremony. It involved multiple people and multiple steps, each performed in a prescribed manner that varied somewhat from household to household, but shared common features across the courts of medieval Europe. The sheets were changed and smoothed. The mattresses were beaten and turned. Process that redistributed the filling and aired out any accumulated moisture. The pillows were plumped and arranged. The curtains were inspected for damage or dirt. In particularly formal households, the bed might be formally blessed or checked for hidden weapons. The latter a genuine security concern in a world where assassination was not merely a literary device, but a real political possibility. The warming of the bed was an important task in cold weather. A warming pan, a long-handled metal pan filled with hot coals or embers, would be passed between the sheets before the occupant climbed in. The coals heated the linen and drove out the worst of the cold that accumulated in bedding during the day. The warming pan had to be handled with care. A careless pass could singe the sheets, or worse, start a fire. The servants responsible for this task were trusted with something genuinely valuable, both materially and symbolically. Fire management was central to the experience of sleeping in a castle, a fire burning in a chamber fireplace, and by the high medieval period, enclosed fireplaces with chimneys had largely replaced the central hearth of the hall, required constant attention. It needed to be built up enough before sleep to last through the coldest hour of the night, but not so large as to create a genuine fire hazard. The embers had to be banked correctly. In the wealthiest households, there might be a servant whose primary overnight duty was to tend the fire, keeping it from dying out entirely but also preventing it from becoming dangerous. The light in a medieval castle after dark was something that deserves its own consideration. Candles and oil lamps provided what illumination there was, but both were expensive, and both represented fire hazards in buildings filled with the wood, textile, and other flammable materials. Candles were made from tallow, rendered animal fat, or, for the wealthiest households, beeswax. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and smelled better, but they were considerably more expensive. Tallow candles smelled of the animals from which they were rendered, and produced a smokier, less pleasant light. The expense of artificial light meant that it was used thoughtfully. After dark, activity in a castle did not simply cease, but it did slow and contract. Tasks that required good light, sewing, reading, fine craft work, were done during daylight hours. After dark, the activities that continued were those that could manage with limited light. Conversation, music, storytelling, prayer, and sleep. The transition from wakefulness to sleep in a medieval royal household was marked by specific rituals. The evening meal, the main meal of the day, had typically been eaten in the early afternoon, but an evening meal or supper was common in wealthier households, was followed by a period of entertainment or conversation in the hall. Music, storytelling, and discussion of the day's affairs were all common. At some point, the lord or king would signal his intention to retire. This signal initiated a sequence of events: the removal of outer clothing, the performance of evening prayers, the consumption of a final drink or small food before sleep, and then the actual process of getting into bed. Medieval medicine had strong views about sleep. The physicians and scholars who wrote about health and the body drew on a tradition going back to ancient Greece, filtered through Arab medical writers and then into the Latin learning of medieval Europe. Sleep was understood as necessary for the restoration of the vital spirits, which were thought to be depleted by the activities of the day. The optimal time for sleep was understood to be after the digestion of the evening meal, which was thought to require the body to direct its heat inward. Going to bed too soon after eating was considered potentially unhealthy, as was going to bed on an empty stomach. The ideal position for sleep was on the right side, which was believed to facilitate the proper movement of digestion. Sleeping on the back was associated with certain health risks, and also, in some religious contexts, with a vulnerability to spiritual danger. The back-sleeping position was thought by some to make a person more susceptible to attack by demons or evil spirits. The duration of sleep was also a matter of medical opinion. Medieval writers generally recommended somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of sleep as optimal for most adults, though they acknowledged that different constitutions and different seasons might require adjustment. The elderly were thought to need less sleep. The very young needed more. Hard physical labour justified longer sleep. Excessive sleep, particularly during the day, was associated with sloth, and was viewed with moral disapproval by religious authorities. But there is something else about medieval sleep that is deeply unfamiliar to a modern reader, something that has only been recovered relatively recently through the work of historians and sleep researchers examining historical documents. Medieval people, by all available evidence, did not sleep in one continuous block as most modern people do. They slept in two distinct segments, separated by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night that lasted anywhere from an hour to 2 or more. The first sleep began shortly after dark and lasted until somewhere in the middle of the night. Then people woke. They lay quietly, or they got up. They attended to tasks. They prayed. They had sex. They talked to household companions. They attended to bodily needs. They reflected on dreams. Then they slept again until morning in what was called the second sleep. This pattern of segmented sleep appears again and again in medieval documents, described so matter-of-factly that it is clear the writers saw nothing unusual in it. The period of waking between the two sleeps was not experienced as insomnia or as a disruption of normal rest. It was part of normal rest. It had its own name in English. The period was sometimes called the watch, or simply the time between sleeps. Medical writers recommended it as an opportunity for certain activities. Religious writers suggested it as a time for prayer. The quality of thought and reflection possible in that quiet middle-of-the-night wakefulness was considered distinctive, closer to the border of dreaming, more fluid, more receptive to spiritual experience. It is possible, even probable, that this pattern of segmented sleep was the natural human sleep pattern for much of human history, disrupted by the introduction of artificial lighting in the modern era, which extends the day artificially and compresses the night, until the long unbroken sleep we now consider normal became the standard. In a castle before the era of gas lighting or electricity, with darkness falling in winter as early as mid-afternoon and lasting until 7 or 8 in the morning, people had 12 or 14 hours of darkness to fill, and they filled them with sleep, wakefulness and sleep again. The experience of a castle at night, the castle as a physical environment, was dramatically different from the castle in daylight. During the day, a castle was loud, busy, populated with hundreds of people going about their various tasks. At night it quieted, but it never became truly silent. Castles made sounds, stone settled, wind moved through corridors and over battlements, producing notes and moans that the inhabitants learned to interpret as normal, but that a visitor hearing them for the first time might find unsettling. Animals, dogs, horses in the stables, rats and mice in the walls, made their own contributions to the nighttime soundscape. The castle at night was also dark in a way that modern people rarely experience. A well-made castle had few windows by modern standards, and those windows were small and high, designed primarily for defence rather than light. At night, with no artificial lighting in corridors or common spaces, the interior of a castle could be profoundly disorienting dark. Moving through it required knowledge, habit, or a candle. Servants who worked at night, those who tended fires, those who stood at watches, those who were responsible for the security of the building, moved through familiar dark spaces with the confidence of long practice, their feet knowing the contours of floors and stairs that their eyes could not see. The watch was a constant presence in a functioning castle. Guards walked the battlements and the perimeter, their rounds regulated by the hours of the night. The night watch in a large castle might involve dozens of men, organised in shift, responsible for detecting and responding to threats that could range from armed attack to fire. The changing of the watch was one of the organising rhythms of the castle night, a sound, a movement, a human presence that punctuated the darkness at regular intervals and reminded even those who were sleeping that the castle was never entirely unguarded. Children in a royal castle had their own sleeping arrangements that differed according to age and rank. Very young children of the royal household slept in the royal nursery, which was a specific room or the set of rooms dedicated to their care, staffed by nurses and rockers, women whose specific function was to sit beside cradles and rock them when the child within woke in the night. The royal cradle was itself an object of considerable care and expense. Royal cradles from the medieval period that survive in museum collections are often elaborately carved and decorated, reflecting the importance placed on the first sleeping place of a royal child. The management of royal infants and their sleep was a matter of genuine concern. The survival of royal children was politically crucial in a world where succession disputes caused wars and where child mortality was devastatingly high, even in the most privileged households. Nurses who watched over royal children through the night were among the most trusted members of the royal household. They slept lightly, their attention always partly directed toward the sounds of the children in their care. The ability to sleep lightly, to wake quickly at any unusual sound, was a professional skill for these women. As royal children grew older and passed out of the nursery, they entered into the world of formal education and household service. Noble boys might be sent to serve in another noble household as pages, beginning a process of education and social training that would occupy much of their adolescence. Noble girls remained in the household but were incorporated into the structured world of female service that surrounded the queen or the lady of the castle. In both cases, the sleeping arrangements of these older children were similar to those of adult servants. Communal, hierarchical, regulated by the needs of the household rather than by the preferences of the individual. The beds of children in Earth's medieval castle were typically simpler than those of adults. Trundle beds, low wooden frames on wheels that could be stored under a larger bed during the day, were common for children and for personal servants who needed to be close to their charges. A nurse might sleep in a trundle bed pulled out from under the great bed of a royal child, close enough to hear and respond to any disturbance, but not sharing the same sleeping surface. This arrangement, the small bed nested under the large one, pulled out at night and pushed away in the morning, was a practical solution to the problem of providing proximity without permanently occupying floor space that was needed during the day. Hygiene before sleep in a medieval royal castle was considerably more elaborate than popular imagination tends to suggest, though also different from modern practice in important ways. The idea that medieval people never bathed is one of the most persistent and most thoroughly wrong popular myths about the period. Medieval people bathed. They bathed regularly. They valued cleanliness, associated it with religious purity, and devoted considerable resources to achieving it. What they did not have was hot running water, the modern plumbing, or the expectation that bathing should be a daily private act. In a large royal castle, bathing might take place in a dedicated bathing room, or it might be accomplished in this private chamber using wooden tubs brought in and filled by servants carrying heated water from the kitchen. The heating of water for a royal bath was a significant undertaking, requiring the sustained effort of kitchen staff over an extended period. This effort meant that baths, even in wealthy households, were not necessarily daily events. They were taken regularly. Historical evidence suggests weekly or bi-weekly bathing was common in royal and noble households, but each bath was deliberate production, The evening ritual before sleep might include not a full bath, but a more targeted washing of the face, hands and feet, the parts of the body most exposed during the day's activities. Foot washing had both practical and symbolic significance. It was associated with religious humility. The washing of feet was a gesture of service and piety rooted in biblical tradition, as well as with practical comfort. Sleeping with clean feet on sheets that were changed regularly was a mark of status and careful household management. The hair care of royal women before sleep was another significant ritual. Women in the medieval period generally kept their hair long, and hair management was a daily task of considerable complexity. Before sleep, hair was combed out, sometimes treated with oils or perfumes and braided or otherwise arranged to prevent tangling during the night. The combing of a queen's or noblewoman's hair was often performed by a lady-in-waiting or personal attendant, and it was one of the intimate services that those attendants provided. The time of hair combing was also a time for quiet conversation. It was a moment of relative privacy and informality within the structured social world of the royal household. The smells of a medieval royal bedchamber were not all unpleasant. The rushes on the floor, changed regularly, might be mixed with sweet-smelling herbs, meadow sweet, lavender, chamomile, and other plants whose scents were both pleasant and believed to have beneficial effects on health and sleep. Herbs were also placed among stored linens to repel insects and to impart their fragrance to the fabric. The bedding of a wealthy households might be scented with dried lavender or rose petals pressed between the layers of fabric. But alongside these pleasant smells were others less attractive to modern sensibilities. Chamber pots, ceramic or metal vessels used for nighttime elimination, were a necessary feature of a world without indoor plumbing. They were kept near the bed or in an adjacent small room called the garderobe, a built-in alcove or small chamber in the castle wall. Its primary function was the storage of valuable clothing, but which was also used for elimination. The smell of the garderobe was, to put it gently, distinctive. Its location in the castle wall was carefully considered. The shaft of the garderobe typically opened onto the outer face of the castle wall, or into a pit below, allowing waste to fall away from the living spaces. But this system was imperfect, and the proximity of garderobes to sleeping chambers meant that their odours were a constant background note in the nighttime experience of even the most luxurious castle. Insects were another constant of castle life. Fleas and lice were endemic, even in the most carefully maintained royal households. They lived in the rushes, in the bedding, in clothing, in the fur linings of expensive garments. They could not be fully eliminated with the tools available. The presence of parasites on the body was simply a fact of medieval life at all levels of society, though the wealthy invested considerable effort in managing and reducing their populations. Regular changing of linens, careful brushing of clothing, the use of herbal repellents, all of these practices helped to limit infestations, but the insects remained. They were part of the nighttime experience of sleep, a low-level irritation that the body eventually learned to accommodate. Beyond insects, there was the question of larger animals. Rats and mice inhabited even the most carefully maintained castles, living within the walls and floors, emerging at night to exploit the food resources that every large household inevitably provided. The presence of cats in castle households was partly a matter of pest control. Cats were valued for their ability to hunt rodents and keep their populations in check. A castle cat moving through the bedchamber at night, investigating corners and walls, was a normal presence. Dogs might also sleep in chambers with their owners, particularly hunting dogs that had developed close relationships with the lords and ladies of the household. The warmth and companionship of a sleeping dog at the foot of a bed was both practically useful, adding to the warmth of the sleeping space, and emotionally comforting in a world where the boundaries between human and animal domestic space were considerably more fluid than they are today. The sounds of animals outside the castle walls were also part of the nighttime experience. Owls, which were associated in medieval symbolism with both wisdom and ill omen, called from the trees. Dogs in the castle grounds barked at disturbances. Horses moved and shifted in the stables. In certain seasons, the sounds of frogs, crickets, and other creatures formed a continuous nighttime chorus. And if the castle was near a town, the sounds of human activity, nighttime guards, bell towers marking the canonical hours, occasional cries or disturbances would also penetrate the stone walls. The canonical hours were the rhythm of the medieval night. The Christian Church divided the day and night into 8 periods of prayer, each marked by bells, and this division was observed with varying degrees of strictness depending on the household and the individuals within it. For monastic communities, the night offices and matins beginning around midnight or 2 in the morning, and lauds following shortly after, thus required actual waking and rising for prayer. For royal and noble households, the relationship to the night offices was less strict but not negligible. The bells that marked the hours were audible throughout a medieval town, and even in a castle at some remove from a town's parish church the sound of bells might carry. Religious observance before sleep was standard. Evening prayers, some form of compline, the last of the daytime hours, or personal devotions, were part of the pre-sleep ritual of most Christian households. Rosaries were kept by beds. Images of saints, particularly those associated with protection during sleep and against sudden death, were positioned where they could be seen from the sleeping position. The fear of dying in one's sleep without having made proper religious preparation was real, and was managed through devotional practice that bookended the sleeping period. The cult of saints associated with sleep and the night was a significant feature of medieval religious life. Saint Christopher, patron of travellers and those in danger, was widely invoked before sleep. The Virgin Mary, in her aspect as protective mother, was frequently addressed in nighttime prayers. Certain other saints were associated with specific nighttime dangers, patron saints against fire, against sudden illness, against the terrors that might come in dreams. The medieval concept of spiritual danger during sleep was taken seriously. The sleeping body was thought to be more vulnerable to demonic influence because the conscious mind's defences were relaxed. Religious objects, blessed candles, holy water, relics, were sometimes placed in or near the bed as protective measures. Dreams occupied an important place in medieval thought, considerably more important than they tend to occupy in our own secular culture. Medieval people believed that dreams could be meaningful, that they could carry prophetic information, that they could be vehicles for divine communication, that they could also, more troublingly, be vehicles for demonic deception. The interpretation of dreams was a recognized skill practiced by physicians who connected dreams to the physical state of the body, and by religious interpreters who looked for spiritual meaning. Kings and queens who experienced significant dreams might consult both types of interpreter and might record the dreams via later reference. Dreams of political consequence. Dreams seen as prophetic of victory, defeat, birth, or death appear frequently in medieval chronicles and other historical documents, reflecting the seriousness with which they were taken. The sleep of a king was, in a very real sense, a matter of state. His health depended on it. His capacity to govern depended on it. His mood the following day, and the mood of a king affected the moods and fates of everyone around him, depended on the quality of his sleep. This gave the people responsible for managing his sleep a genuinely significant role. The gentleman of the bedchamber, the groom of the stool, the personal attendants who managed the physical environment of the royal sleeping room were not merely body servants. They were, in their own way, managers of power. The waking of a royal person in the morning was as ceremonious as the going to sleep had been. In formal royal households, the lever, the ritual, morning waking, was a public or semi-public event. Courtiers assembled in the outer chambers of the royal apartments, waiting for the signal that the king or queen was awake and receiving. The first attendants entered the inner chamber and performed the first services of the morning, drawing back the bed curtains, presenting clothing, providing water for washing, bringing the first food or drink of the day. Others followed in ranked procession, each performing their assigned function in an order that precisely mirrored the social hierarchy of the court. Their ceremony of waking is important because it reveals something essential about the nature of sleep in a royal castle. Sleep was not a withdrawal from public life. It was part of public life, bookended by public ceremonies, managed by professional staff, governed by rules and expectations, and located in spaces that, though called private chambers, were never truly private in the modern sense. The bed was a throne of another kind. The sleeping body of the king was a political body even in its most vulnerable and defenceless hours. Outside the royal apartments, the rhythms of sleep in a large castle household were varied and overlapping. Night workers, kitchen staff who began work before dawn to prepare food for the household, guards who walked their watches through the darkness, stable hands who checked on the horses, the almoner's clerk who recorded the distribution of food and charity, moved through the sleeping castle on their own schedules. The boundaries between working time and sleeping time in a large medieval household were not as clean as they might appear from a distance. People slept when they could, woke when they were needed, and accommodated their bodies to the demands of the household's needs with the flexibility born of necessity. The kitchen of a large castle was among the busiest spaces in the entire complex, and it was busy at hours that would surprise a modern observer. Bread baking required ovens that needed to be lit and brought to temperature hours before the bread was actually baked. Stock and pottage, the thick soups and broths that formed the basis of everyday eating in a medieval household, required long, slow cooking that might begin in the evening and continue through the night. Kitchen boys and lowest-ranking cooks might sleep fitfully near the kitchen fire, one ear always attuned to the needs of the cooking process, waking to stir, to add fuel, to check the progress of foods that required attention through the night. The stores of a large castle, the larder, the pantry, the buttery, the cellar, were closely guarded even at night. The household supply of food, drink, and other necessities represented enormous value, and its security was taken seriously. A lockable larder or wine cellar protected the most valuable stores. The medieval concept of household hierarchy was encoded in access to these stores. The right to take from the castle's provisions was a privilege, carefully regulated, reflecting the elaborate social structure of the household. Bread was perhaps the most fundamental element of the castle diet, and its production shaped the nighttime rhythm of the bakehouse. The bakers who produced bread of the large castle household worked on a schedule that was almost the inverse of the sleeping schedule of the castle's upper ranks. They began their work in the small hours of the morning, mixing and kneading dough in the pre-dawn darkness, loading the ovens before first light, producing the loaves that would be distributed throughout the household at breakfast. The bread of the castle was not all the same. The finest wet bread, white and soft, went to the highest-ranking members of the household. Coarser bread, darker and denser, was made from rye or a mixture of grains and went to servants and lower-ranking household members. The hierarchy of the castle was written in its bread as clearly as it was written in any formal document. Water management in a castle influenced the night time as well. Many castles had wells within their walls, providing water for cooking, washing and drinking. The drawing of water was physical labour, and it happened throughout the day and sometimes through the night as needed. Larger castles might have sophisticated water systems that use gravity to bring water from elevated sources through lead pipes to specific points within the castle. But even in these more elaborate systems, the work of water management, maintaining cisterns, clearing blockages, drawing from the well when other sources failed, fell to specific members of the household staff. The hours between midnight and dawn were the hours when a castle was most like itself, most reduced to its essential nature. The great display of the court, the elaborate clothing and ceremony of the public day was laid aside. People slept or moved quietly through darkness on necessary errands, or lay awake in the middle of the night wakefulness that was then a normal feature of human existence. The stone was silent, the fire was low. Outside, the sky was either dark and full of stars, or clouded and black, or silvered with moonlight that fell through the narrow windows and lay in cold geometric shapes on the stone floors. The moon was something that medieval people noticed in a way that many modern urban dwellers do not. Without significant artificial light, the lunar cycle shaped the nighttime experience meaningfully. A full moon provided genuine illumination that extended human activity into hours that would otherwise have been impenetrably dark. The phrases used in medieval documents, phrases about travelling by moonlight, about certain activities being best performed on moonlit nights, reflect this practical relationship with the moon's light. A new moon brought darkness that was more absolute and that affected both the sense of security and the practical capacity to move through the world. Stars, too, were more visible than they are to most people today. The lack of light pollution meant that a clear night in a medieval castle looked up at a sky of extraordinary density and brilliance. Medieval astronomy and astrology, which were not clearly distinguished as separate disciplines in the way we now separate them, attributed significance to the positions and movements of stars and planets. The configuration of the sky at the moment of sleep or at the moment of waking could be read by those with the requisite knowledge as containing information about what the coming day might bring. Court astrologers were real figures in royal households, their counsel taken seriously, their observations of the night sky regarded as practically useful. The changing of the seasons shaped the sleeping experience in a castle more profoundly than in a modern, centrally heated building. Winter nights were very long, very cold, and required the most elaborate defensive measures against the cold. The heaviest bed hangings, the most carefully tended fires, the most layered bedding. The vulnerability of even the richest household to the cold of a winter night was real. Accounts survive of wealthy individuals who took extraordinary measures to stay warm at night, wearing woolen nightcaps that covered the ears and neck, sleeping in specially designed nightgowns of heavy wool or lined silk, using heated bricks or metal warming implements to maintain temperature through the night. Summer nights were shorter, warmer, and in some ways more challenging for different reasons. The warmth that made winter night difficult was replaced by heat that could make sleeping uncomfortable. The same bed hangings that trapped warmth in winter could make a summer bed stifle. The insects that were a minor irritant in winter became a significant presence in summer. Castle windows were typically covered not with glass. Glass was expensive and not universally used in castle windows, but with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or in the most expensive households, genuine glass. In summer, the management of airflow and light in sleeping chambers required its own set of adjustments. The transition between spring and summer and between summer and autumn brought its own rhythms. Spring in a castle was a season of renewal in a very practical sense. It was when stored food from winter was running low and fresh food was beginning to become available again. The quality of sleep in late winter and early spring might be affected by the limitations of the winter diet, which was low in certain nutrients. The reappearance of fresh green vegetables, early spring herbs, and eventually the spring slaughter of some livestock meant a genuine improvement in the dietary situation that had practical effects on health and, indirectly, on the quality of rest. The sound of bells marking the canonical hours was the clock of the medieval castle. The liturgical day began at Vespers in the late afternoon and moved through Compline, Matins, Lauds, Prime, Terce, Sext and None. Each hour a point of orientation in the daily and nightly cycle. The bells of a nearby chapel or church, or the bells of a castle chapel if the castle was large enough to have one, sounded at each of these hours, and these sounds organised not only religious observance but the practical rhythms of the household. Kitchen fires were stoked at certain hours, guards changed the watches at certain hours, morning preparations began at certain hours. All of this was regulated more or less by the sound of bells. The castle chapel was a significant space in the spiritual life of a medieval royal or noble household. Evening services there, attended by at least some members of the household, were part of the transition between the waking day and the sleeping night. Some castle had private oratories adjacent to the Lord's chamber, small rooms with a window through which the occupant could observe the altar and participate in services without leaving the private apartments. These arrangements allowed the lord or lady of the castle to maintain a relationship with religious observance even during illness or at times when moving through the public spaces of the castle was impractical. If we try to piece together what a full night in a medieval royal castle might actually have felt like from the inside as an experience rather than as a historical description, we arrive at something that is simultaneously familiar and strange. The human need for warmth, safety, and rest is constant across centuries. The anxiety about illness, about the future, about those one loves, these too are constants. What is different is almost everything about the context in which those constant needs were met. The darkness was different. The sounds were different, the smells were different. The physical objects surrounding the sleeping body were different, more elaborate in some ways, simpler in others, all specific to their material moment. The social arrangements were different, in ways that cut deep. The presence of others, the absence of genuine solitude, the theatrical quality of even the most intimate moments of daily life, the way in which the private body of even the most powerful person was simultaneously a public and symbolic object. And yet, lying in that great curtained bed in the middle of the night, in the wakefulness between the first and second sleep, listening to the sounds of the castle, the settling of stone, the distant call of the watch, the breathing of the attendant sleeping nearby, the low breath of the fire. One can imagine something that is not so distant after all. The mind turning over the events of the day, the body grateful for warmth, the darkness gentle or troubling depending on what the heart contains, the future uncertain as it always has been, the present, for a moment, sufficient. This is what it would like to sleep in a medieval royal castle. Not the fairy tale of solitary candle-lit magnificence, but something more textured, more social, more physically present, and in its way more fully human. A sleep that belonged to its time and place, shaped by the materials and beliefs and social structures of a world that is gone but not entirely lost. A world that left its marks in stone and textile and written record, waiting to be found by anyone willing to look past the image and into the thing itself. The castle is quiet now. The fire has burned down to coals. The curtains of the great bed are drawn. Outside the window, the stars are moving in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the sleeping forms below. The watch is changing. The bells will ring again at dawn. Until then there is only the dark and the warmth and the sound of breathing and the long, slow work of rest. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from sleeping in the same place, night after night, for years. The body learns the room. It learns the particular creak of the floorboards near the door, the way the fire spits in wet weather, the angle of light that comes through the window just before dawn and falls across the foot of the bed. This embodied knowledge of a specific sleeping place is something that the inhabitants of a medieval castle accumulated over years of residence, and it is a form of knowledge that rarely appears in historical documents, not because it was unimportant, but because it was so obvious, so deeply assumed, that no one thought to write it down. The servants and attendants who lived in a castle for decades knew their building the way a person knows their own body. They knew which stairs were steeper than they looked, and which doorways were lower than expected. They knew where the draughts came from, and where the warmth collected. They knew the sounds the castle made in wind and rain and frost, and they knew the difference between the sounds that were normal and the sounds that were not. This knowledge was a form of competence, accumulated over time, inseparable from the work of caring for a great household. For those who came new to a castle, a queen arriving at a husband's residence after marriage, a young noble placed in a great household for education, a travelling guest received for an extended stay. The first nights were often disorienting in ways that went beyond simple unfamiliarity. A new sleeping place meant new sounds, new smells, new qualities of darkness. The body's learned responses to its familiar sleeping environment were of no use here. Sleep might come reluctantly or not at all. This experience of displacement was real and was acknowledged in the period. Letters and accounts mention the difficulty of sleeping in strange places, the longing for familiar beds and familiar sounds. The marriage of a royal or noblewoman typically involved exactly this kind of displacement. A princess betrothed to a foreign king might find herself transported not just to a different castle, but to a different country, a different language, a different culture. Everything about her sleeping arrangements would change. The design of the bed, the materials of the bedding, the rituals of preparation, the identity of the women attending her, the ladies in waiting she had grown up with, who had shared her bedchamber and helped her sleep through childhood and adolescence, might not be permitted to accompany her. New attendants selected by her husband's household would take their place. In this context, the bed and its rituals were not merely practical matters, but deeply personal ones, and the displacement of familiar sleeping habits was part of the larger displacement that royal brides experienced in navigating new households and new identities. Some queens and noblewomen brought their own beds with them when they travelled or when they entered a new household. The bed was so personal, so associated with the body and with the most private aspect of life, that carrying it from place to place was considered reasonable and sometimes necessary. The elaborate inventories of royal possessions that swept from the medieval period often list beds and bedding among the most carefully described items, reflecting both their monetary value and their personal significance. The management of royal children's sleep was influenced by medical theory in ways that sometimes seem strange by modern standards, but made complete sense within the framework of medieval medicine. The humoral theory of the body, the idea that health depended on the proper balance of four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with specific qualities, temperatures, and seasons, shape the practical recommendations given about when and how children should sleep. Infants were generally thought to need the most sleep, and the swaddling of infants, the practice of wrapping a newborn tightly in linen bandages for the first months of life, was partly connected to beliefs about sleep. Swaddled infants were easier to keep still, which made them easier to carry, but the practice was also believed to be medically beneficial. It was thought to help shape the soft bones of the infant body, prevent injury, and maintain the warmth believed necessary for healthy development. The tight wrapping also practically prevented the infant from rolling, and made the work of the women watching over it somewhat less anxious. But it meant that the infant's sleep was constrained, and that the act of sleep was itself a managed, medically supervised activity from the very beginning of life. The wet nurse who fed a royal or noble infant occupied a position of considerable importance in the household. Because breastfeeding and fertility were understood to be connected, a nursing woman was less likely to become pregnant, and pregnancy was believed to affect the quality of breast milk. The wet nurse's own reproductive life was subject to regulation. She was expected to be in good health, of good character. The moral qualities of the nurse were believed to pass through her milk to the child, and to maintain certain dietary and behavioural standards while nursing. She was also responsible for the infant's nighttime feeding, which meant her own sleep was interrupted by the needs of her charge. The intertwining of her body with infant's body, her sleep disrupted by its waking, her milk time to its hunger, was a form of labour that was intimate, skilled, and poorly recorded in formal historical sources. As the royal child grew and moved from infancy to early childhood, the rituals of sleep changed. The child who had been swaddled and cradled was now a person who walked and talked and required education. The transition from the nursery to the schoolroom was not a single moment, but a gradual process, and it was accompanied by changes in sleeping arrangements that reflected the child's growing status and changing needs. A royal boy might begin to share a sleeping chamber with a male tutor or with other boys of similar rank who were being educated alongside him. The close physical proximity of the sleeping chamber was itself understood as part of education. Boys sleeping together learned from each other, observed each other's habits and character, developed the social bonds that would shape their adult relationships. The education of royal children is well documented in some respects. We know what subjects were taught, which tutors were employed, what books were used. What is less often described is the texture of the learning environment, which extended into the sleeping hours. A good tutor in a medieval royal household was expected to be present not just during formal lessons but throughout the day, available to answer questions, to correct errors, to model appropriate behaviour. The evening hours before sleep were sometimes used for reading aloud, a practice that blended education with entertainment and with the gentle drift toward rest that characterised the end of the medieval day. Books in a medieval royal household were objects of great value. A royal library might contain dozens or hundreds of volumes, each one a product of extraordinary labour, copied by hand, illustrated by specialised artists, bound in expensive materials. These books were read aloud as much as silently. Reading aloud in the evening to a gathered audience or to a single person preparing for sleep was a common practice. The texts chosen for evening reading might be histories, romances, devotional works, or other genres, depending on the taste and religious inclination of the household. The practice of being read to sleep, the gentle, rhythmic quality of a skilled reader's voice continuing through the edges of consciousness as sleep approached, was not the exclusive province of childhood. Adults in a medieval royal household might be read to in the evening as a regular feature of the day's conclusion. Music also accompanied the transition to sleep in royal and noble households. The musicians of a medieval court were expected to perform in the Great Hall during feasts and public occasions, but they also performed in more intimate settings, in the private chambers of lords and ladies, in the evenings before sleep. The repertoire of music suited to these quieter moments was different from the music of public celebration, slower, softer, more contemplative. Certain instruments were particularly associated with evening and with sleep. The lute, with its soft rounded sound, the harp whose sustained notes could fill a room without overwhelming it, the psaltery which produced a delicate high-pitched tone well suited to quiet spaces. The texts of songs from the medieval period sometimes address sleep directly, lullabies for children, songs of evening prayer and rest, love songs whose imagery drew on the metaphors of night and sleep and dreaming. The boundary between music and prayer was more fluid in the medieval period than we might expect. Many of the songs performed in private chambers in the evening had explicitly religious content, drawing from the Psalms or from devotional poetry, blending the aesthetic pleasure of music with the spiritual function of evening prayer. The connection between the body and the soul was understood differently in the medieval period, and this understanding shaped the experience of sleep in specific ways. The soul was believed to be active during sleep, though the nature of that activity was debated. Some thinkers believed that the soul was liberated during sleep, free to travel or to receive divine communication in ways that were impossible during waking. Others were more cautious about the activities of the soul in sleep, warning of the dangers of demonic deception through false visions. The theology of dreams was a genuine area of intellectual concern, discussed by serious thinkers and referenced in sermons and devotional literature. For a king or queen, lying in the great curtained bed in the middle of the night, in the silence between the two sleeps, these were not abstract theological questions. They were the questions of a person lying in the dark, aware of their body's vulnerability, aware of the political stakes of their survival, aware of the fragility of everything they had built or been given. This spiritual dimension of nighttime experience in a medieval royal castle was not a decorative addition to the practical reality of sleep. It was part of the texture of that experience, present in the rosary on the bedpost, in the saint's image on the wall, in the prayer said before lying down and the prayer said upon waking. in the attention given to the content of dreams and the concern about what the soul encountered in its nighttime wanderings. Illness changed everything about sleep in a castle. When a king or queen was ill, the entire rhythm of the castle shifted. The bedchamber that was normally managed by its usual staff of attendants was suddenly a medical theatre as well. Physicians, who in a royal household were among the most educated and respected members of the court, brought with them their own practices, their instruments for testing urine and examining stools, their bags of medicinal herbs and compounds, their astrological charts, because the positions of planets were considered medically relevant to the treatment of illness. They might recommend changes to the bedding, to the heating of the room, to the foods and drinks consumed, to the hours of sleep and waking. The diagnosis and treatment of illness through sleep and its qualities was a recognized area of medieval medicine. The timing of sleep, the position of sleep, the content of dreams, the quality of waking, all of these were considered diagnostically relevant. A physician attending a sick royal patient would ask about the character of the previous night's sleep as part of his assessment, and his recommendations might include specific adjustments to sleeping conditions. The patient was not simply expected to lie still and wait for recovery. They were expected to participate in their own healing by following medical instructions that touched on virtually every aspect of their daily and nightly experience. Recovery from illness was gradual, and the return to normal sleeping arrangements was itself a process that had social meaning. A king who had been confined to his chamber by illness and who was now well enough to appear publicly in the great hall was making a statement about his health and his power. The first public appearance after illness. The return from the private, vulnerable world of the sick chamber to the public world of the court was an event that was noted and that carried political significance. The bed, which during illness had been a place of weakness and incapacity, became again a place of legitimate power. The beds of the sick in a medieval castle were sometimes moved or reconfigured to accommodate the specific requirements of illness. A patient with a fever might need different bedding, a different position relative to the fire, different curtains that allowed more or less air circulation. The practical management of a seriously ill royal patient was a demanding task that required the skilled attention of multiple people over extended periods. The household that managed this care well was doing something genuinely important for the stability and survival of the power structure that the royal body represented. The deathbed was the ultimate version of the royal bed, the most public, the most ceremony-laden, the most politically significant. Death in the medieval period was ideally not a private event. The ars moriendi, the art of dying well, was recognized literary and spiritual genre that described the proper way to die, surrounded by family and clergy and trusted attendants, having made confession and received the last rites, having settled one's affairs and given one's final instructions. Death in the bed, attended and witnessed, was a good death. Death alone, sudden or without preparation. This was a bad death, a dangerous death, a death that raised questions about the state of the soul and about the practical arrangements that had not been made. The deathbed of medieval king was therefore managed with the same care and ceremony that had been applied to every other aspect of his sleeping life. The chamber was prepared, the clergy attended, family members were summoned. The political hierarchy assembled around the dying man, and as death approached and then arrived, the body that had been the centre of so much elaborate management, dressed and washed each morning by trained attendants, provided with the best possible materials for warmth and comfort, surrounded by the music and prayer and ceremony of a great household, was finally allowed to be simply a body lying still, released from the responsibility of power. What happened to the castle after a death was a subject that medieval writers addressed with some frequency, because the interregnum, the period between the death of one ruler and the formal installation of another, was a time of potential political instability that everyone had an interest in managing carefully. But the practical management of the dead body itself, in the days between death and burial, also involved the bed and the bedchamber. The body was laid out, washed, and prepared by attendants, dressed in appropriate clothing, placed in the chamber where it would receive visitors who came to pay their respects. The lying in state was the final version of the public display of the royal body, and it was managed with the same care for ceremony and hierarchy that had characterized every other aspect of royal life. After the funeral, the royal bedchamber had to be cleared and prepared for its new occupant. The linens were changed. The bed might be dismantled and reassembled, or replaced entirely, if the new ruler preferred different furnishings. The objects that had belonged to the dead king, the rosary, the personal devotional images, the small items of daily use that had accumulated over years of occupation, were distributed according to will and custom. The room that had been shaped by one person's presence and preferences was emptied of that presence and made ready for another. This continuity of the bed and the chamber, the same physical space occupied by successive bodies, generation after generation, gave the great castles of medieval Europe their particular quality of temporal depth. The stone of the walls was old when the current occupants were born and would be there when their grandchildren were old. The furniture might change, the textiles would change, the specific individuals who managed the household would change, but the structure persisted, accumulating the traces of all the lives that had been lived within it. The great royal castles that survive today, those that have not been destroyed by war or revolution or simple neglect, are in many ways palimpsests. They are texts written over and over on the same surface, each generation adding its layer to what was already there. The medieval sleeping chambers that can still be visited in castles in England and France and in Germany and across Europe retain something of the physical reality of the past, even when they have been emptied of their original contents. The shape of the fireplace, the depth of the window embrasures, the angle of the stone floors, the height of the ceilings, all of these are original features unchanged from when the rooms were in daily use, and standing in one of these rooms in the silence of a modern museum, it is possible to feel the presence of the past in a very specific, very physical way. The stone walls, remember, in their way. Not in any mystical sense, but in the simple physical sense that they are old stone and quarried and cut and assembled by hands that have been dust for centuries, shaped into rooms that were inhabited by people whose bodies are gone but whose arrangements persist. The window that let in the morning light still lets in the morning light. The floor that was walked by servants carrying warming pans and fresh linen is still there under the feet of tourists carrying cameras. But the space that was once a private world, governed by elaborate rules, filled with specific smells and sounds, inhabited by specific bodies in specific arrangements, is now a public space, a museum piece, historical exhibit. And yet something of the original purpose clings to these rooms. When you visit a medieval bedchamber in one of these preserved castles and stand in the quiet, in the particular quality of quiet that old stone rooms have, a quiet that seems to absorb rather than simply lack sound, you are standing in a place that was specifically designed for the management of human rest. Everything about it was arranged with that purpose in mind. The depth of the walls was part of it, their insulation. The position of the fireplace was part of it. The shape of the window embrasures, which could be fitted with cushioned seats to create private spaces for reading or quiet conversation, was part of it. The dimensions of the room, calculated to be large enough for the bed and its attendants, and the necessary furniture, but not so large as to be impossible to heat, were part of it. These rooms were not designed by people who thought abstractly about the problem of shelter. They were designed by people who had specific knowledge of specific bodies and their needs, who had observed over years what worked and what did not, who had accumulated practical wisdom about the management of warmth and light and sound and the particular requirements of people of specific ranks and health conditions. This practical wisdom is encoded in the architecture of the rooms themselves, legible to anyone who takes the time to look. The mattresses are gone, the curtains are gone, the warming pans and the chamber pots and the rosaries and the small devotional images are gone, scattered into museums and private collections in simple decay. But the rooms are there, and if you stand in one long enough, in the fading light of an autumn afternoon when the stone is beginning to feel cold, you can begin to understand in your body rather than just in your mind something of what it was like to be in this place when it was alive. The cold is real. The darkness that will come when the light outside the windows fades is real. The distance from anything familiar, the enclosure of the stone, the sense of the building as a thing that extends far beyond this single room into corridors and stairways and chambers and halls, gone, all of this is real. And in that physical reality, the historical imagination finds its footing. The people who slept here were people. They were cold. They were sometimes frightened. They were sometimes ill. They loved specific individuals and grieved when those individuals died. They looked out these same windows at seasons changing and at skies that looked, from this distance, exactly as they look today. Their sleep was shaped by different beliefs, different materials, different social arrangements than ours. But the need for sleep itself was the same. The vulnerability of the sleeping body was the same. The way the mind, in the quiet between the first and second sleep, turns over what has happened and what might happen, this was the same. The relief of warmth, the comfort of familiar voices nearby, the slow surrender of consciousness to rest, these are constant. They do not change. They connect us across the centuries and across the vast difference of circumstance, to the people who slept in these places and woke again, and went on with their lives. Sleep is the most egalitarian of human experiences, in one sense. Everyone does it. The king does it, and the kitchen boy does it, and the lady in waiting does it, and the gate guard does it, in between their rounds, sitting upright against a cold stone wall. The bodies that lay in this room over the centuries ranged from powerful to powerless, from healthy to dying, from young children who had never known another home to old people who had lived here for 50 years. All of them slept here. All of them lay in this space and let consciousness go. What connects us to them is not our knowledge of their politics or their religious beliefs or their social arrangements, though all of those things are interesting. What connects us is the simple fact of the shared human need, the body's requirement for rest, the mind's retreat into unconsciousness, the gathering of warmth against the dark. The castle is quiet. The fire, if there were a fire, would be burning low. The curtains, if there were curtains, would be drawn. The bells will ring again at dawn. Until then, there is only the dark, and the warmth, and the sound of breathing, and outside the window the stars continuing their ancient movement across a sky that has not changed, and the slow, patient endurance of the stone. This was sleep in a medieval royal castle, not the fantasy, the thing itself. There is another dimension of sleep in a medieval castle that we have not yet fully explored, and it is one that requires some care to describe, because it involves the body in ways that the period itself addressed with a mixture of practical attention and spiritual concern. The medieval understanding of the body during sleep extended to questions of sexuality, reproduction, and the complex relationship between physical appetite and moral discipline that shaped so much of medieval life. Marriage in a royal household was a dynastic matter before it were a personal one. The sleeping arrangements of a royal couple were therefore never simply private. They carried political significance in a very direct sense. The production of an heir was a matter of state, and the bed in which that heir was conceived was, symbolically, a site of political production, as well as biological reproduction. The witnesses to a royal marriage ceremony were witnesses not merely to the exchange of vows, but to the beginning of a process whose culmination was expected to be the birth of children who would continue the dynasty. The royal wedding night was surrounded by ceremony. The couple was escorted to the bridal chamber by attendants of both households. The bed was blessed by a priest. The curtains were drawn. The attendants withdrew, though often not entirely, remaining within earshot or even within the room itself in some versions of the ceremony, as witnesses that the marriage had been consummated in the legal sense that the period required. The documentation of consummation was not merely prurient curiosity. In a world where marriages could be annulled on grounds of non-consummation, and where the validity of an heir's legitimacy might be challenged by political enemies, having witnesses to the bridal night was a form of legal protection. The marriage bed was thus one of the most politically charged sleeping spaces in the entire castle, and the anxieties that surrounded it were real and consequential. A queen who did not produce an heir, or who produced only daughters in a dynastic culture that required male successors, was in a precarious position that affected every aspect of her daily life, including her sleeping arrangements. The question of who occupied the queen's bed, and on what schedule, and with what results, was a matter that the entire court had a stake in and an opinion about. Medical advice on the production of healthy children included specific recommendations about the timing and conditions of conception, and these recommendations touched on sleeping arrangements in specific ways. The optimal time for conception was thought by medieval medical writers to be early in the morning, after a night of good sleep had restored the vital spirits. Certain positions were recommended for their supposed superiority in promoting conception. The dietary and behavioural states of both partners in the days preceding attempted conception were considered relevant. A king or queen wishing to produce an heir had, in theory at least, a body of medical advice available to them that touched on every aspect of their physical life. The management of pregnancy in a royal household was an elaborate affair that shaped the queen's sleeping arrangements in significant ways. As pregnancy advanced, the queen might move to lying in chambers specifically prepared for her use in the later stages of pregnancy and through the birth itself. The lying-in was a formal withdrawal from public life into a carefully prepared female-dominated space, where the queen would remain from a specific point before the birth until a specific point after it. A period of seclusion that lasted typically around a month before a birth and a month after, though this varied by time period and custom. The lying-in chamber was prepared according to established conventions. The windows were partially blocked or hung with tapestries to control the quality of light. The bed was specially furnished for the comfort of the pregnant woman and in preparation for the birth itself. A fire was kept burning at all times, regardless of the season, because warmth was considered essential for the newborn's survival and for the mother's recovery. The women who populated this space, the midwife, the nurses, the ladies-in-waiting who remained with the queen throughout, were chosen carefully, and their presence was continuous. The lying-in was an intensely social female experience in which sleep and waking, birth and recovery were all managed collectively within this enclosed, warm, carefully prepared space. The birth itself was a nighttime event, as often as not. Labour, of course, does not follow the schedule of the court. The women attending a queen in labour through the night were performing one of the most demanding kinds of nighttime attendance. The midwife, whose skill and experience were critical, might have spent decades attending births and had developed the kind of embodied practical knowledge that only comes from being present at a great many difficult moments. The successful delivery of a royal heir was an event of enormous significance, and the midwife who accomplished it was rewarded accordingly, sometimes with gifts of extraordinary value, sometimes with pensions, sometimes with land. The recovery period after childbirth, the churching period during which the queen remained in her lying-in chambers before being formally readmitted to public life through a religious ceremony, was also a period of specific sleeping arrangements. The new mother needed rest, and the new infant needed feeding and constant attention. The rhythms of a newborn's sleep and waking imposed themselves on the sleeping patterns of all the women in the lying-in chamber, creating a domestic world ordered around the biological demands of the smallest and most demanding of its inhabitants. The churching ceremony, which marked the queen's return to public life after childbirth, was a formal religious occasion that had both spiritual and political dimensions. It marked the end of the seclusion period and the reopening of the queen's apartments to normal social and political traffic. But the sleeping arrangements, even after churching, might remain somewhat modified from the pre-pregnancy norm for some time, as the queen's body recovered and as the management of the infant continued to require specific staffing and attention. Back in the broader castle, away from the royal apartments, the servants and lower-ranking members of the household managed their sleep in conditions that were considerably less elaborate. The Great Hall, as we have noted, was a sleeping space for many. But within the hall and throughout the castle, there were gradations of comfort and privacy that reflected the hierarchical structure of the household with great precision. A senior officer of the household, the steward, the chamberlain, the constable, might have a private chamber of his own, a small room that provided genuine separation from the communal sleeping spaces of the hall. This chamber might be simple by the standards of the lord's apartments, but it was private, a significant privilege. A clerk in holy orders working in the castle's administrative offices might sleep in a chamber shared with one or two colleagues, separate from the hall, but not entirely private. A senior servant in the kitchen or the stable might have a defined sleeping space within their area of responsibility, a corner of the kitchen near the fire, a room above the stable, that provided proximity to their work and a degree of separation from the general population of hall sleepers. The allocation of sleeping space in a large castle was itself an administrative task, managed by the household officers who were responsible for the daily functioning of the establishment. Who slept where? Who shared a chamber with whom? Who was permitted access to the better sleeping spaces? All of this was governed by the same hierarchical logic that governed every other allocation of resources within the castle. Social rank, length of service, specific function and personal favour all played a role in determining where one slept and under what conditions. The bedding of lower-ranking household members was simpler in material but not necessarily absent. A straw-filled mattress, a woolen blanket, and perhaps a rough pillow were the minimum expected provision for any permanent member of the household. Truly impoverished individuals who attached themselves to great households as casual labourers or beggars who had been given shelter might sleep on the bare rushes of the hall floor, with nothing but their clothing for covering. The spectrum from the royal bed with its multiple mattresses and its layered textile hangings to the bare floor of the hall represents the full range of material experience in a medieval castle, and every point on that spectrum was occupied by a real person with a real body and a real need for rest. The seasonality of castle life affected the sleeping experiences of all ranks, but it affected the lower ranks more severely because they had fewer resources with which to manage the cold. A powerful lord could afford thicker curtains, more firewood, heavier bedding. A kitchen servant sleeping near the fire in the kitchen passageway was warm by virtue of proximity to the cooking fires, but the warmth was uneven and often smoky. A guard walking the battlements in winter was cold in a way that required genuine physical endurance. The wind that moved across exposed stone battlements in a northern European winter could be brutal, and the protective clothing available to a medieval soldier, though designed with this reality in mind, was not sufficient to make the experience comfortable. The stories that servants told each other, in the long hours between watches or in the quiet of shared sleeping chambers, were part of the texture of castle life that rarely mixed into formal historical records, oral culture, the jokes, the gossip, the cautionary tales, the stories of strange events and remarkable people, was the medium through which most people in a medieval castle processed their experience and transmitted it to others. The conversations that took place in the semi-darkness of a shared sleeping chamber between people lying on their pallets waiting for sleep to come would have ranged from the mundane to the genuinely interesting, from complaints about the day's work to stories about the Lord's private habits to speculations about what was happening in the wider world beyond the castle walls. The world beyond the castle walls was not entirely absent from the experience of those inside. News travelled, even in a world without newspapers or reliable postal systems. Travellers passed through. Merchants came and went. Visiting lords and their retinues brought information from other parts of the kingdom and from beyond it. The public spaces of the castle, the great hall at mealtimes, the courtyard, the gatehouse, were places where information circulated and was discussed. And some of that information followed people to their beds, shaping the thoughts that accompanied them into sleep and the dreams that might follow. The relationship between the waking world and the dreaming world was more permeable in medieval experience than it tends to be in modern secular culture. Dreams were taken seriously, not as psychological events. That framework did not yet exist, but as potentially meaningful communications from beyond the ordinary. A troubling dream was not necessarily a sign of stress or digestion, but might be a message, a warning, a divine communication, or a demonic deception that required careful interpretation. The morning after a significant dream was a morning of heightened interpretive attention, as the dreamer shared the dream with trusted companions or advisors and worked to understand what it might mean. The professional interpreters of dreams in a medieval royal court were not a separate class of specialists, but were typically either physicians who interpreted dreams through the lens of humoral medicine and the physical state of the body, or clergy who interpreted them through the lens of theology and scripture. A king who dreamed of fire might be told by his physician that it reflected an excess of yellow bile in his system, requiring dietary adjustment. He might be told by his confessor that it was a divine warning about the moral state of his kingdom. He might be told by his astrologer that it reflected the position of Mars in his birth chart. All three interpretations could be offered simultaneously and taken seriously simultaneously, because the medieval mind was comfortable with the coexistence of multiple explanatory frameworks, in a way that the modern mind, trained to expect a single correct answer, can find difficult to inhabit. The nighttime experience of prayer, which was part of normal sleeping practice for devout members of a medieval royal household, deserves more attention than it typically receives in historical accounts, which tend to focus on the formal, public aspects of medieval religious life, rather than its intimate, private dimensions. But the hours of the night were particularly associated with prayer in medieval religious culture, and the practice of waking in the night to pray, either as part of the formal canonical hours or simply as a personal devotional habit, was widespread among people of genuine religious feeling. The psalms that were central to medieval Christian prayer had their own relationship with night and sleep. Psalm 91, which promised divine protection against terrors of the night and pestilence and destruction, was among the most frequently cited protective texts for the nighttime hours. The imagery of sleeping safely under divine protection, the Lord as guardian who neither slumbers nor sleeps, provided a framework for understanding the vulnerability of sleep in theological terms. To fall asleep was to entrust oneself to divine protection, and the prayers said before sleep were both an expression of that trust and a practical measure for securing it. The particular quality of prayer in the small hours of the night, in the silence between the first and second sleep, when the castle was as quiet as it ever became, and the darkness outside the narrow windows was complete, was understood by medieval writers as a special mode of spiritual experience. The contemplative tradition within medieval Christianity distinguished between active prayer, performed during the business of the day, and the deeper, more receptive form of prayer possible in stillness and quiet. The night, with its enforced silence and its removal of the distractions of the day, was considered particularly conducive to this deeper form of spiritual attention. The cells of monastic communities, the private oratories of great lords, the simple pallets of humble servants who found a moment to kneel before sleep, all were sites of this nighttime prayer that was such a consistent feature of medieval spiritual life. The transition from prayer to sleep was not a sharp boundary but a gradual one, and the medieval understanding of the relationship between the two was more intimate than our secular culture tends to assume. Sleep and contemplative prayer were understood to occupy neighbouring territory at the edge of ordinary consciousness, and the movement from one to the other was natural, even desirable. The physical posture of nighttime prayer was various. Some people knelt beside their beds, some lay in bed with their eyes open, directing their attention inward. Some held objects, a rosary, a carved crucifix, a small reliquary, that served as physical anchors for the wandering mind. The objects of medieval devotional life, which survive in museums in considerable numbers, were not primarily public objects. They were private ones, carried in the pocket or worn next to the skin, or kept beside the bed, handled in moments of anxiety or need or habitual practice, worn by use into the specific shape of the person who used them. A medieval Queen's Prayer book, an illuminated book of hours, perhaps, with its calendar of saints' days and its sequences of prayers for the canonical hours, was among the most personal objects in her possession. It was used daily, carried to chapel and back, marked with notes and drawings added over years of use. When she lay in bed at night and said her prayers before the first sleep, she might hold this book or read from it by candlelight. The book was her companion in those liminal hours, a connection to the community of faith that extended through time and space beyond the walls of her chamber. The experience of aging in a castle and the way it changed the experience of sleep is rarely addressed in historical accounts, but was real and significant. A king who had slept well for most of his life might find, in his later decades, that sleep become more difficult, more broken, less restorative. The physical ailments that accumulated with age, the joint pains and respiratory difficulties and digestive problems that were common in an era before modern medicine, made comfortable sleep harder to achieve. The mattresses that are inadequate for a younger body might not be adequate for an older one, with more specific physical needs. The cold that a younger person had managed with reasonable ease might become, for an older person with less physical resilience, a genuine threat. The old age of a medieval king was a period of political as well as physical vulnerability. A king who was visibly weakening provided an opportunity for potential successors and political rivals. The management of the royal body in its decline was therefore a task with high political stakes, and the people responsible for it, the physicians, the bedchamber star, the family members who attended the aging king, were navigating a delicate situation in which the appearance of health had to be maintained, even as the reality of decline became hard to conceal. The dying king in his bed is, in one sense, the logical culmination of everything we have been describing. All of the elaborate management of the royal sleeping life, all of the ceremony and the staff and the expensive textiles and the medical attention and the spiritual protection was ultimately in a service of the biological reality of a human body that had a beginning and would have an end. The great bed that had been the centre of the royal sleeping experience was also eventually the place where that experience concluded. But this conclusion was not the end of the castle's sleeping life. Another body would take the place of the one that had departed. The bed would be prepared again, the curtains drawn back and replaced, the linens changed, the fire renewed. The cycle of sleep and waking that had animated this space for centuries would continue. New occupants inheriting the same stone rooms, the same fireplaces, the same narrow windows looking out at the same sky. And so we return at the end of this long description to the thing itself, the experience of a human body in a stone room at night, seeking warmth and rest in a world that was cold and uncertain. Everything we have described, the ceremony, the hierarchy, the medical theory, the religious practice, the social arrangements, the practical management of cold and dark, was in service of this simple biological requirement. Beneath all of it, beneath the king and the queen and the ladies in waiting and the grooms and the physicians and the confessors and the astrologers and the kitchen boys and the gate guards, beneath all of the elaborate social scaffolding of a medieval royal castle, there was a body that needed to sleep, and it did sleep, as all bodies do, as bodies always have, since before there were castles or kings or any of the human arrangements we build around the simple fact of our biological existence. The elaborateness of the arrangement tells us something important. It tells us how much was invested in protecting this particular body, how much social and political meaning had accumulated around its rest and its waking. But the sleep itself was the same sleep that every living person seeks every night. Quiet, dark, warm, if possible, shared more often than not, brief in the long view. And then the morning comes, and the curtains are drawn back, and the cycle begins again. This is what it was like to sleep in a medieval royal castle. Rest well. There remains one more thread to pull, one more aspect of the castle's sleeping world that we have touched on but not fully examined. The role of the castle's physical architecture as a shaper of sleep experience. The buildings themselves were not neutral containers for the lives that unfolded within them. They were designed, modified, and maintained with specific purposes in mind, and those purposes were closely connected to the needs and habits of the people who occupied them. The development of the castle bedroom across the medieval period reflects a gradual shift in values, a slow movement toward the kind of private space that we now take for granted, but which, in the earlier medieval period, was genuinely novel. The great hall, which had served as a communal sleeping space for the entire household in earlier centuries, was gradually supplemented and then supplanted by a growing set of private rooms that clustered around and behind it. The process by which this happened was slow and uneven, varying considerably between different countries, different cultures, and different levels of wealth and social ambition. In England, the development of the sola, a private upper-floor room often accessible only through the Lord's chamber, represents one strand of this movement toward privacy. The sola was typically south-facing, oriented to catch the best light of the day, and it served as a private sitting room and sometimes sleeping room for the Lord and his immediate family. Its elevation above the hall, both physically and symbolically, expressed the separation between the Lord's private world and the communal world of the household below. The stairs leading up to the sola were a boundary, a threshold, and crossing them without invitation was a significant social transgression. The gradual elaboration of the private apartment, the suite of rooms that surrounded the Lord or King's personal space, reflects the growing value placed on personal privacy as a mark of status. To have privacy was to have power, to be able to withdraw from the common spaces, to have rooms that others could not enter without permission, to have an interior world that was genuinely separate from the exterior performance of public power. No, all of this was desirable, and became more desirable as the medieval period progressed. But privacy in the medieval sense was never absolute, and it was never solitary. The private apartments of a great lord were populated, they were staffed. They had a social life of their own that was distinct from the social life of the great hall, but was no less structured and no less governed by hierarchy. The innermost chamber might be the most private space in the castle, but it was private only in the sense that access to it was restricted, not in the sense that the person who inhabited it was ever truly alone. The architecture of these inner chambers reflects the needs that was designed to serve. Thick walls and small windows provided both defence and insulation. Fireplaces were positioned to maximise the heating of the room. Built-in furniture, stone window seats, alcoves for storage, recesses for candles or lamps, reduced the need for freestanding furniture and made the room easier to manage. The doors between chambers were positioned and sized to regulate access in a carefully considered way. Some doors were wide and ceremonially prominent, marking the transition from one social zone to another. Others were narrow and inconspicuous, providing passage for servants who needed to move through the space without disrupting its social choreography. The garderobe, which we mentioned earlier in its capacity as a site of elimination, also functioned as a storage space for valuable clothing. The logic of this combination was not arbitrary. The smell of the garderobe's shaft, which carried the ammonia from accumulated waste, was believed to repel the moths and other insects that damaged stored fabric. Placing fine woolen garments in this smelly location was therefore a practical preservation strategy. The word garderobe itself means, in its origins, a place for keeping clothing, and the elimination function was secondary to the storage function in the original design. Over time, the elimination function came to dominate the word's meaning in many languages, reflecting the way in which memory of practical arrangements fades, while the more colourful detail persists. The light in a medieval castle sleeping room was managed through a combination of architectural and material means. Window openings were sized and positioned to balance the need for light with the need for security and insulation. Shutters of wood or of oiled cloth could close the openings against rain and wind. In the wealthiest households, leaded glass filled some windows, providing light without the direct exposure to outside air. The introduction of glass into castle windows was a gradual process, and the presence of glass was itself a marker of wealth and status. Glass was expensive, fragile, and difficult to produce in large pieces. Artificial lighting in the sleeping chamber was carefully managed. Candles were placed in specific locations, projecting brackets on the walls, in hanging candle holders above the central space of the room, on tables and surfaces around the room, in patterns that reflected both practical illumination needs and aesthetic conventions. The light of candles is directional and intimate. It creates pools of illumination surrounded by shadow, a quality very different from the even, diffuse light of modern electric rooms. Reading by candlelight required positioning the candle carefully, holding the book at the right angle, and accepting a quality of light that was considerably lower than what modern readers consider comfortable. The tallow candles used by most of the castle's inhabitants, made from rendered animal fat smelly of their origins, producing a yellowish flickering light, were very different from the beeswax candles used in royal chapels and in the apartments of the wealthiest members of the household. Beeswax candles burned cleaner, brighter, and longer, and their relative cost meant that their use was a genuine marker of social distinction. The allocation of beeswax versus tallow candles to different parts of the castle household was a detail of household management that expressed the hierarchy of the household in a daily practical way. The fire in a bedchamber was both a practical necessity and a symbolic presence. The management of fire, in a world without central heating, without radiators, without any source of warmth other than the body heat of living creatures and the controlled burning of fuel, was a central domestic skill. It required knowledge of fuel, of combustion, of the specific behaviour of a particular fireplace in particular weather conditions. A fireplace that drew well in calm weather might fill the room with smoke when the wind was from the wrong direction. A fire built too large in a small room could create dangerous heat and increase the risk of conflagration. The fire tender who managed a great lord's chamber fire had to balance warmth, safety, and efficiency in a way that required real skill. The wood used for fuel in a castle was itself a significant economic resource. Different woods burned differently. Some produced more heat, some burned longer. Some were more prone to sparking, some produced less smoke. The management of the castle's wood supply was a year-round concern. Wood had to be cut, seasoned, stored, and carefully allocated among the many fires that burned throughout the castle complex. A large castle might have dozens of fireplaces in daily use, each consuming substantial amounts of fuel. The logistics of keeping all of these fires burning, the cutting, transport, storage, and distribution of firewood, employed a significant number of people and represented a significant portion of the castle's annual expenditure. Peat, in regions where it was available, offered an alternative to wood. Peat burns slowly and produces considerable heat, but it produces more smoke than well-seasoned wood and has a distinctive smell. The smell of a peat fire is one of those sensory experiences that is entirely absent from the modern experience of most urban and suburban dwellers. But that was a familiar, constant presence in many medieval households, particularly in Ireland, Scotland, and other parts of northern Europe where peat bogs were abundant. The smell clings to fabric and hair, and becomes, for those who have grown up with it, simply the smell of home and warmth and sleep. Coal was also used in some medieval households, particularly in regions of England where it was accessible. Sea coal, carried by ship from the coalfields of the northeast, was available in London and other coastal towns by the high medieval period. Its use spread gradually, though its heavy, sulphurous smell made it less desirable for use in private apartments. It was more commonly burned in industrial processes, in smithies, in lime kilns, in other applications where the smell was less of a concern. Then in sleeping chambers. The transition to coal as a primary domestic fuel would come later, but its presence in the medieval period is a reminder that the energy landscape of the past was more varied and regionally specific than general accounts tend to suggest. All of this practical management of the castle's physical environment, the fire, the candles, the bedding, the windows, the access to water, the allocation of sleeping space, was the work of a large and specialized household staff whose daily and nightly labor made possible the experience of sleep for the castle inhabitants at every level of the social hierarchy. This staff has left relatively few direct traces in the historical record. Their names appear occasionally in household accounts, their positions are sometimes described in household ordinances, but their interior experience, what they thought about their work, how they understood their place in the castle's world, what they hoped for and feared, is largely inaccessible to us. What we can say is that their work was real and skilled, that it required genuine knowledge and sustained physical effort, and that it shaped in fundamental ways the experience of everyone in the castle, from the king in his great curtained bed to the kitchen boy sleeping by the embers of the morning fire. The human infrastructure of sleep, the invisible labour that created and maintained the conditions for rest, was as important as any other aspect of castle life, and its invisibility in historical accounts reflects not its unimportance, but the way that essential labour tends to become invisible precisely because it is so constant and so taken for granted. To sleep well in a medieval royal castle, you needed people. You needed people who would tend your fire, warm your bed, manage your clothing, attend to your nighttime needs, maintain the security of the building, and provide the continuous human presence that was both a practical necessity and an emotional comfort in a world where the night was long and dark and the threats, real and imagined, physical and spiritual, were many. The solitary sleeper of the romantic imagination was not the typical inhabitant of a medieval castle. The typical inhabitant was surrounded, attended, embedded in a web of human relationships that extended through every hour of the day and night. And this embeddedness, this continuous social presence, was not experienced as oppressive by most of those who lived within it, or at least there is little evidence that it was. The value placed on solitude and privacy that characterizes modern sensibility was not absent from the medieval period, but it was configured differently. Privacy was sought and valued, but it was the privacy of the inner life, the capacity to have thoughts and prayers and feelings that were one's own, rather than the privacy of physical space that is our primary concern. A queen surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting, her every waking and sleeping moment observed and attended, might still have a rich interior life that was genuinely private, genuinely her own, genuinely sustaining. The social world of the castle at night, for all its noise and smell and physical inconvenience, was also a world of human warmth, in the most literal and the most figurative sense. People who slept near one another shared body heat. They shared the comfort of another's breathing in the dark. They were available to one another in the night's moments of fear or illness, or the simple restlessness that comes to everyone at 2 a.m. This availability was not nothing. In a world without emergency services, without hospitals, without the infrastructure of care that modern people rely on, in moments of crisis, the presence of other people, known, trusted, physically close, was a form of security that had genuine value. The old joke that people in the past slept together because they had to, not because they wanted to, misses something important. They did have to in a practical sense. But the practice of sleeping together, sharing beds, sharing rooms, sharing the long hours of the night with known companions, also created and sustained a form of human connection that was real and meaningful. The intimacy of shared sleep is not a trivial thing. It is one of the ways in which human beings, across cultures, across history, have been close to one another in the fullest sense. In a medieval royal castle, this intimacy was organized by hierarchy and managed by ceremony, but it was not for all that less than genuine. The queen who slept in her great curtained bed with her ladies nearby, the kitchen boy who slept by the fire with the warmth of another body close to his, the guard who knew that his relief would come at the appointed hour and that he was not entirely alone in the dark, all of these were connected to others by the shared experience of the night's passage, by the common vulnerability of the sleeping state, by the human need that no amount of ceremony or hierarchy can entirely manage away. This is finally what sleep in a medieval royal castle was. Not the fairy tale, not the nightmare, something in between, and stranger than either. A world organized with extraordinary care around a biological necessity that it could not entirely manage, surrounded by ceremony that acknowledged the political importance of the royal body, while also acknowledging the limits of human control over its most fundamental processes. A world in which the most powerful person in the kingdom was also, every night, simply a person who needed to sleep. A world in which the stone walls that expressed the permanence of power also sheltered the fragile warmth of living bodies against the cold and the dark. The night comes, the fire burns low, the prayers are said, the eyes close, and sleep, which makes no distinctions of rank or ceremony, takes everyone in the end. One final thing deserves to be said about the experience of sleep at a medieval royal castle, and it is something that tends to be lost in the cataloguing of practical details and social arrangements. The people who slept in these places had inner lives. They had memories and desires and fears that accompanied them into the dark. They dreamed in ways we cannot know but can perhaps imagine. They woke in the middle of the night with thoughts that had no audience but themselves. They lay in the warmth of their beds and thought about love or loss, or the business of the coming day, or nothing in particular. The way the mind wanders when the body is still and the world is quiet. These interior experiences left almost no direct traces in the historical record. We know what people did and said and wore and ate in considerable detail from the household accounts and the chronicles and the administrative records that survive. We know the social arrangements, the hierarchies, the rituals. What we rarely know, and what we can only approach through careful and empathetic imagination, is what it felt like to be in these places, what the quality of the darkness was from the inside, what the sound of the fire meant to a person lying awake and listening, what comfort or fear the presence of others in the room provided, what the mind did in the long middle of the night when the castle was quiet. Imagination is a historical tool, used carefully with respect for what is known and humility about what is not. It allows us to approach the texture of past experience in ways that a better recitation of facts cannot. The person lying in a great curtained bed in the middle of the night was a person. They had a body that was cold or warm, comfortable or in pain. They had a mind that was active or still, at peace or anxious. They had relationship with the people sleeping nearby that was formal or familiar, or both simultaneously, as human relationships often are. They were, in their own moment, as fully present and as fully engaged with the reality of their existence as any person who has ever lived. To think about them as historical objects, as illustrations of social structure, or material culture, or political history, is valuable and necessary. But it is also incomplete. The history of sleep is, at its deepest level, the history of human consciousness encountering its own vulnerability, finding strategies for managing that vulnerability, and creating around it the elaborate human architectures of care and ceremony and social organisation that we have been describing. It is a history that connects us across the centuries to the same essential experience. We still sleep. We're still called in the night if we are not careful. We still need others in our various ways, and we still find ways to be close to them or to protect ourselves from them. We still lie awake in the middle of the night with thoughts that are sometimes clear and sometimes confused. We still move in the early morning hours between the residue of dreams and the beginning of the day's concerns. The technology that surrounds our sleep is different. The social arrangements that frame it are different. The beliefs that give it meaning are different. But the sleep itself, the biological event at the centre of all these arrangements, is the same. The stones of the medieval royal castle are still there in many cases. The rooms are empty now or filled with museum displays. The fires are out. The beds are gone. The people who slept in those rooms have been gone for centuries. But the rooms remember them in the way that old rooms do, in the shapes worn into floors by long use, in the marks left on walls by generations of hands, in the proportions and arrangements that reflect the specific human needs they were designed to serve. To sleep in such a place, if it were possible, To lie in the dark of one of those old stone rooms and listen to the particular quiet of ancient walls, to feel the specific quality of the cold that emanates from old stone, would be to touch something of the past in the most direct way available to us. Not to understand it intellectually, but to feel it in the body. To know, with the body's knowledge rather than the mind's, something of what it meant to be warm and sheltered within these walls while the night passed outside them. That knowledge is available to us at a remove through the patient work of imagining and studying and attending to the details that history has left behind. It is the work of this kind of story, the slow, careful reconstruction of an experience from its traces, to bring that knowledge as close as possible to the place where the body and the mind can both receive it. The night's passed and the fire has burned to coals. Somewhere, in a castle that still stands, the stone is doing what stone does, holding the cold, holding the dark, holding the long memory of all the lives that passed through it. The stars outside are the same stars that medieval people looked at through the same narrow windows. The dark is the same dark, and somewhere in it the bells will ring again at dawn, as they have always rung, calling the living back from wherever sleep has taken them into the ordinary, extraordinary business of another day. Rest now, the story is done.